Okay, I call that 7:31. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Could a few of you just put up your hands to show me that you can hear me? That would be a nice thing. Okay, good. You can hear me. And could anybody tell me if I'm too loud or too quiet, or is all well?
No,
okay,
fine,
thank you very much.
fine.
Well, listen, this is very good. I'm very pleased to see you all at, or not actually at, the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre this evening. And we have yet another of our Tuesday talks. A couple of weeks ago, we had one of the great gurus of our world, Rupert Sheldrake, and tonight we have another one. David is one of the people, like there are many of them, but I think he and Rupert are two of the most important, who have, in Britain at least, pursued and investigated matters spiritual and alternative and paranormal and so on for a very considerable number of years. David's older than he looks, I have to tell you this. And he has written many books, he's written many articles, and he's organized many conferences and edited a journal for many years, all under the aegis of his outfit, which is the Scientific and Medical Network, whose name, of course, was designed to avoid anything too woo-woo. Scientific and medical sounds pretty good, and they are, and we are scientific and medical, but we think there is something else as well, and that there is more to be said other than the scientific materialist thing. His endless interest has been remarkable. He's going to talk tonight about consciousness, which is one of our central topics. Philip Goff will be talking about consciousness later in this series. So will I, so will Chris Rowe. So it is a very central thing, and he's going to give it some historical background as well. So, and while David's talking, if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, and I will pick it up afterwards or during the talk, or alternatively, you can just join the conventional Q&A. Anyway, David, over to you, dear boy, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much indeed, Lance, and the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. And good evening from the southwest of France. I live in the Cathar area of France, and it's raining and dark outside. We're having a bit of a change of weather. They tell us that 25 tomorrow with sun, so that can't be bad. So I'm going to go down and share my screen with my slides, and then we'll get going. Right, that's the right one, and I'm going to play from beginning, play from start. There we go. Good. And then I need to turn off my, move my hide thumbnail. Right. So my title this evening is Gnosis in the Future Science of Consciousness. We don't really have it in the present science of consciousness, hence the word future there. And let me just see why this is not working. Wait a minute. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking for the arrow, and normal things are not working. So I'm gonna begin with saying something about an extraordinary book written by Peter Kingsley last year, Catafalque, Jung and the End of Humanity, because it sets the context, or a context, what we're talking about here. And in the book, he talks about the origins of philosophy in the sacred, in mysticism, in initiation, and Gnosis, and particularly the work of the pre-Socratic philosophers, so-called Parmenides and Empedocles. And he writes, philosophy, logic, science, and even the apparent arts of reason all have their origin in the experience of another world. Now that's a shocking statement. If you're looking from a sort of modern materialistic point of view. In other words, that it was a different state of consciousness, that the unitive state of consciousness that gave rise originally to philosophy and what became science. And this is a quote or a reference to Henri Corbin. There is no true philosophy which does not reach completion in the metaphysic of ecstasy, no mystical experience which does not demand serious philosophical preparation. and such precisely was the dawning wisdom. And the reason I put in Syed Hossein Nasser there is because he, in his book Knowledge and the Sacred, which the Gifford lectures given at Edinburgh, he says that knowledge is inseparable from bliss. Real knowledge is inseparable from bliss. And what Kingsley said about himself is it's his duty to shock people into an awareness that all life comes from and returns to the sacred. Anne Baring might well say the same thing. And this is also the message of indigenous people. Now, this slide is quite dense in the sense that it has a lot of content in it, this is the process that I understand to be operative in human beings, in human life. And so we have a journey from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, a journey from separation, density, and polarity towards unity and wholeness, and a process of emanation where the world and phenomenal life is unfolded, and then a refolding or return to the source, to the implicate, as David Bohm would say. A movement from the periphery, the edge, to the center. A process of forgetfulness and ignorance, falling into forgetfulness and ignorance, and then a corresponding process of remembering, aletheia, and wisdom. So lethe means forgetfulness. So the river of Lethe in Greek mythology is the river of forgetfulness. So aletheia is unforgetting, if you like, hence the equivalence of remembering with the Platonic idea of knowledge. Then a process from sleeping to awakening, a journey from darkness to light, a descent followed by an ascent, a transformation of lead into gold, the process of expanding the self with a small s to the self with a capital S, and a journey from unconscious unity to conscious oneness. And I'm hoping this is all going to work. I can't see anybody at the moment because my mouse is frozen, but I think if I click, it goes to the next slide. It does. So here you have the three levels of identity according to Gnostic schools. The hylics, associated with hyli, meaning matter in Greek, identifying with the body. These are what we would call physicalists in modern terminology. The psychics, corresponding to the psyche, nothing to do with psychics in the sense of we normally use it, but those who are operating at the level of the soul, the psyche. And they see themselves as part of the whole, and the symbols here is a symbol of water, and pistis, which is faith in Greek. And then the pneumatics, and one, again, this is a strange term for modern ears, from pneuma, which is a spirit, which is gnosis, and corresponding to light and fire. They don't see themselves as part of the whole, they know they are the whole. This is a critical distinction. They know they are the whole. In other words, they identify with the universal mind, and this is the level of the spirit. So what I'm arguing here, and I don't think it's controversial in terms of coming from a Gnostic or Gnosis perspective, is that Gnosis, this sense of oneness with the underlying spirit, accesses deeper structures of reality, in fact, by becoming those very structures. So here is April DeConnick, and I'm going to talk about her a little later on, saying our essential human self or spirit is nothing less than God's very own life essence, waiting to be reawakened through Gnosis. And she also argues that Gnosis is transgressive and countercultural. And she, in fact, will be speaking to us exactly this time next week. But you may be on another AC/DC talk. Jung's Red Book. Some of you will know about Jung's Red Book. It was published in, I think, 2009. edited by Shiv Dasani, and it's an enormous book. It's an extraordinary book because it's a large format with his italicized writing and his own illustrations, his own paintings. And so this represents the deep psycho-spiritual process that Jung went through for maybe over a decade after the beginning of the First World War, so from 1919. And in it, he contrasts the spirit of this time, which would also be the spirit of our time, with the spirit of the depths. The first would like to hear of use and value. The spirit of the time wants to hear about use and value, still true today. But that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. In other words, this is the eternal spirit, not the one that's tied into time. And he explains that this injunction, as it were, took away his belief in science and forced it down to the last and simplest things, and to place his understanding and knowledge, quote, at the service of the inexplicable and the paradoxical, the melting together of sense and nonsense, which produces the supreme meaning. Now, this from a sort of scientific and philosophical point of view sounds like nonsense, but the point is it's beyond these polarities which philosophy and science are actually conducted within. And so this is now Kingsley. He concludes the spirit of the time is blind to what really matters, preferring to live on the surface rather than plumbing the depths, seeking out what is reasonable, rational, and therefore comfortable and respectable. This is a huge thing within science and academia, that we don't want to look unreasonable, irrational. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to feel uncomfortable. We want to be accepted and respectable, but that may be incompatible with truth. Here in this slide, I want to contrast the spirit with the letter and the law. So these labels, and this is the kind of rhetoric that goes on, an anti-rhetoric, if you like. Those who are the mystics, the Gnostics, the prophets, they are the heretics. And the scientists and academic, and particularly the organized skeptics movement, just call all of this woo-woo. And if you look up the definition of woo-woo, it really doesn't have much of a definition. It's just a rhetorical device to try and poo-poo something that you don't really understand. And I refer down here to gnowing, which is the knowledge of Gnosis. And I got this phrase from Ninian Smart, who gave some lectures in about 1979, Gifford lectures, when I was in Edinburgh. So I went to listen to them. And he said you have to distinguish between knowledge and knowledge. Knowledge is what we normally think of knowledge, but knowledge is gnosis. This is this knowledge by identity, knowing something because you are it. And so Kingsley said the existence of a transcendental reality is indeed self-evident, that the world inside and outside us rests on a transcendental background, is as certain as our own existence. Again, this is a shocking statement for the modern mind, this certainty of a transcendental reality. But I entirely agree with him. I think this is where we should be starting, rather than denying the possibility of transcendental reality and pretending that the only reality is sense-based, that we construct and can see from a sense point of view. So what happened is that the living gnosis was translated over the centuries into institutional dogma. And he writes, the spirit and fire of Christ had to vanish, to be stamped out. So the birth of the church's second crucifixion and death, what a terrible thing to say. And after that, the only way the spirit of Christ could stay alive was inside the heart of a few hidden heretics and mystics, who were then persecuted or burnt as witches. And the story of the Jung Institute is a very amusing one, because what happened was that the Jung wanted the Institute to be an interdisciplinary research center where people could come, and it was open doors, and you could think anything, provided you investigated it all systematically. And after it was set up, it was sort of taken over by the Jungians. And eventually, at another meeting of the Jung Institute, the director said that Jung didn't really understand what the Jung Institute was about, which was training Jungians. And this is the last thing that he wanted. And he famously said, "Thank God I'm not a Jungian." So he talks, this is Kingsley again, he talks about the real meaning of prophecy as people who speak on behalf of the divine reality within. And here's his definition here: one who at any moment in history speaks or writes or communicates faithfully, accurately, without interfering with the process on behalf of the divine, serves as a mouthpiece to record exactly what the sacred is needing to convey. That's a huge responsibility, being a prophet in this sense. And then returning deep into the past until you're brushing against the root of yourself, your primordial beginning and ultimate point of origin. Again, this is an extraordinary statement, but because we think of what is correct being in the present, with our present understanding. But he suggests that we need to go into the center of ourselves in the past. Their role is always to conform to the divine will, to state what the collective awareness of people is not able to grasp, not yet able to grasp. Jung himself did this, and Kingsley is doing the same. Still less to face the collective darkness, which is unconsciously projected outwards onto others of the shadow. And this is a hugely important theme, and we see it all over the place now in terms of the demonizing of the divisions, the splitting, the demonizing of others. And with the current COVID situation, you've got the demonizing on both sides, and those who think more alternatively like me, and those who are orthodox, who are able to remove postings from people like me from the internet. So I think that this situation that he talks about is now writ large on the planet. And we are arguably going through a planetary near-death experience or initiation. I put Chris Bacher's name in brackets there. He's going to be speaking at one of our seminars on the 22nd of October on his new book, LSD and the Cosmic Mind, which I can't recommend highly enough. And the reference to Dunov there is that the master or the teacher is the externalization of the divine. And so we need to understand that role and listen carefully to what sages have to say. So this again is paradoxical. Jung saying that the primordial agent is something new, and that the task is to give birth to the old in a new time, which is the perennial task of being able to express the spirit, the importance of things in the language that can be understood in the present time. And here is Kingsley again. We don't have a future left without prophets willing to take us back to the primordial reality of what we are. So this, you could say, is a kind of collective identity crisis, that we need to remember who we are at this deep level, and also remember that who we are is the divine center, which is in everybody. And so we're not fundamentally separate. And that's the modern thinking, although not the most advanced science, is based more on separation, individualism. And so this is what I feel, that we're cut off from our ancestors, from our roots, from our center, from the sacred, from our deepest identity, and from the earth. And that we urgently need to return to this center and re-establish contact. And I think a lot of the very severe mental health problems at an existential level can be traced back to this loss of being cut off from our roots and our center, and being told by materialistic science that the world is an accident and there's no meaning in life. And so the story is one that gives us really no reason to hope and move forward. So what needs to happen is a rebirth, but beyond the personal into the impersonal, universal aspect of ourselves, so that we no longer live for ourselves and become a source of life to others. So we are in service to others. And this, my kind of time of life, I feel this is incredibly important. to see what ways in which we can be of service to others. Interesting, I read these essays by Simone Weil. They include one on the Cathar Renaissance, the Albigensian Renaissance, by identifying the impersonal with the sacred as the realm of truth and beauty. And this quotation comes from the museum of a Cathar, 20th century Cathar called Déodat Rocher, R-O-C-H-E acute, who was a magistrate, and he lived until he was over 100. And he had a correspondence during the Second World War with Simone Weil. And Simone Weil had this wonderful phrase, which is that nothing in modern thinking, including science, that it provided us with what she calls une nourriture spirituelle insuffisante, an inadequate spiritual nourishment. This slide refers to a book by Jung called Aion, which is part of his collected works, subtitled Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. And he writes this, and I was really struck by it when I reread it. So I read the book quite a number of years ago. The God image is immediately related to or identical with the self, and everything that happens to the God image has an effect on the latter. Any uncertainty about the God image causes a profound uneasiness in the self and destroys the continuity of historical tradition, which is the hallmark of civilization. And so what he's saying is that the decay of our idea of God leads to a corresponding decay of who we think we are. And again, it's this question of losing our center and being uprooted and being cut off. And this is Jung's phrase here: the destruction of the God image is followed by the annulment of the human personality. It's the most striking remark, and one which I think is true at a spiritual level. And then there's a couple of lines from Yeats's Second Coming: things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. This was written just at the end of the First World War. What we need to recover, I think, is to get a sense of the priority of information, knowledge, and wisdom. And this is from The Rock, the second part of the first part is from Four Quartets. We should be aiming at a condition of complete simplicity, but it costs nothing, not less than everything, i.e. our whole superficial personality has to be set aside in order to reach this new level of consciousness. And he asks in this chorus in The Rock, where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? And it doesn't take a genius to work out that we've got ourselves completely lost in information at the expense of knowledge, let alone the expense of wisdom. And so what I think we need to do is reverse these priorities. So focus primarily on wisdom, next on knowledge, and then information should come a third, even though we're surrounded and drowning out in it. So this brings to a close, I think, most of my remarks on Kingsley. It's only by shedding everything, including ourselves, which is costing not less than everything, that we sow the seeds of the future. So there's huge responsibility for individuals as well, because we all participate in the collective process by our own spiritual process. And we need to open up to what's going on inside ourselves, to dreams, and look out for synchronicities and balance, as Iain McGilchrist would say, the hemispheres. This is just a slide about, which I find this idea very helpful, from Saint Bonaventure, who was a medieval schoolman, about the three eyes and three lenses. So you can see these are contemplation, reason, and sense. So contemplation corresponds to what is traditionally called the intellect. And I say traditionally because intellect is now confused with reason. And the level of gnosis, or non-dual knowledge, nous, the higher intelligence. Then we have the eye of reason, mathematics and logic, which is in Greek is dianoia. And then the eye of sense, And what you can see, and this is my next point here, that the church, philosophy, psychology, and science downgrade inner knowing and gnosis, and that modern science looks only through the lenses of reason and sense, and is also left hemisphere dominated in Iain McGilchrist's sense, looking for control rather than creative interaction. And this is the paradox here, that the observer, the knower, subject, and consciousness actually excluded from the picture. And I've got a quote coming up from Schrödinger to that effect. And hence the West has suffered what this again is back to Kingsley's, a metaphysical amputation, which I entirely agree with the suppression of gnosis in favor of pistis and belief, i.e. the overriding of more superficial type of knowledge. And now unbelief, which is just the opposite of belief, it's still a belief. So here's Schrödinger, and this is from an essay of his he wrote on nature in the Greeks, which has a foreword by Sir Roger Penrose. I cut out my mind when I construct the real world, quote unquote, around me, and I'm not aware of this cutting out, then I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives us a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it's ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our hearts and that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, qualities in other words, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good and bad, God and eternity. So what Schrödinger is pointing out here is that there are some intrinsic limitations to science. Science can't explain everything metaphysically, can't explain purpose, can't explain qualia. It can quantify and analyze these things, but it can't explain them within the limits of its own approach to knowledge. Then we have Max Planck, and this is a very famous quotation given in an article, 1931, an interview with The Observer. I regard consciousness as fundamental. Matter as derivative from consciousness. This is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist talking, someone who invented quantum theory. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. There is no matter as such. It exists only by virtue of a force bringing the particle to vibration and holding it together in a minute solar system. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. The mind is the matrix of all matter. It's a most extraordinary statement. And if you take it seriously, and then I believe it forms the basis for a proper and new and more advanced and Gnostic science of consciousness. So one of the questions you can ask yourself is how you position this whole realm of consciousness in relation to science. At the moment, what science is tending to do is to try and put consciousness inside science. But the Gnostic or the Gnosis approach would be to do it the other way around, that actually science is within consciousness, as Max Planck has just pointed out. So the first view takes the third person perspective. So the brain produces the mind, matter is primary, the importance is what the neural correlates of consciousness are, and it's a quantitative approach, and it assumes that the brain produces consciousness. The brain produces consciousness. Then the science within consciousness view says, this is the first person perspective, which we all experience ourselves, is the primacy of mind rather than matter, or at least the fundamental nature of mind, and of qualities and qualia are immediate experiences. And this suggests, along with the evidence from psychical research, that what we need to develop is a filter theory or a transmission theory of mind, rather than assuming as a metaphysical premise that the brain produces consciousness. So this was put forward systematically by a number of philosophers in the late 19th century, including William James and his Ingersoll lecture on immortality, and his Varieties of Religious Experience, lectures he gave in Edinburgh in 1901 to 1902. So I think there are trends in this direction. Interest in mysticism, that Underhill's book came out over 100 years ago. So Alistair Hardy's analysis of religious and spiritual experience, the understanding of NDEs, laboratory parapsychology, humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology. Emergence of non-duality is something very strong. I've just been doing a course on that run by a man called Jeffrey Martin. And then finally, the textual discoveries at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt in 1945 and the Gnostic Gospels. So all of these are moving, in my view, in the direction of Gnosis as more primary than sense perception. So my argument is that NDEs and mystical experience are in fact a form of Gnosis and initiation into a deeper structure of reality, where you find light and love, predominantly light and love. And it produces a transformation, metanoia, which is the Greek for what's translated as repentance often, but it isn't, it's beyond the mind, metanoia. And the injunction here is to know yourself in a Delphic sense. So here's a couple of quotations from near-death experiences, just to illustrate the theme. I just found myself in this extremely bright light and felt absolute peace. I feel that light and the peace, so I felt the light and the peace are one. I had no sense of separate identity. I was in the light and one with it. So it's a classic non-dual experience, or experience of Gnosis. I came into the arc of pure golden love and light and noticed that love and light go together. This radiation of love entered me, and instantly I was part of it and it was part of me. As I became one with this omnipresent light, its knowledge became my knowledge. Now, this is someone that very few people have heard of. Most people will have heard of Walter Russell if they've been to a lecture by me, because they'll have heard me mention him. But he was an extraordinary genius. And this is his rather amazing, I think, bust of Mark Twain. And he did Mark Twain Memorial, which is an enormous frieze of different sculptures. And he only started sculpting when he was in his 50s. He's already distinguished as an artist. And his first subject was Edison. And he wondered on the way down to meet Edison how he was going to manage. He'd really have to rely on his divine guidance, which he did. And it was a huge success. You could look that up on the internet. Then he had a 3-week mystical experience in which he entered into the divine mind and understood how the physical universe is related to the divine mind. And he published this in a book called The Universal One, which is an extraordinary book. I have a copy, but it's quite heavy reading. And he sent 850 copies to all the most distinguished people he could think of, and didn't get a single reply. Mind you, if you're going to read 300 pages before you're going to reply, there aren't many people who, even in those days, had time to do that. So he says, all knowledge exists in the mind universe of light, which is God. All mind is one mind, and I'm going to reinforce that point. We do not have separate minds. All knowledge can be obtained from the universal source of all knowledge by becoming one with that source. So this is knowledge by identity, which is Gnosis. Cosmic consciousness is the goal of human development, whereby we as individuals become aware of our oneness with the universal mind and can manifest genius. I think this is an absolutely true statement and something that is useful to understand. Aldous Huxley, this comes from the perennial philosophy, said knowledge is a function of being. When there's a change in the knower, being of the knower, there's a corresponding change in the nature and amount of knowing. And again, if you think about extending your capacities, extending your perception or understanding means you can understand or perceive things you weren't able to before. And this brings you to a position of reciprocity, where Eckhart, the medieval mystic, said, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. And you really need to read that twice to understand. It's still not very understandable for the left hemisphere. But I think, again, it's absolutely true. When you move to a more universal aspect of yourself, you realize there is only one mind perceiving itself, and you're a part of the system. Now, here's another example of the same point. I'm just reinforcing this same point of this oneness of mind and consciousness. This is Charles Harnell. If you want to look up the reference, the Master Key System is a most extraordinary book, which I can recommend to you. Started off as a correspondence course in 1916. There is one principle of consciousness pervading the entire universe. As this consciousness is omnipresent, it must be present within every individual. Each individual must logically be a manifestation of that omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent consciousness, even if it doesn't feel like it. Your consciousness is therefore identical with the universal consciousness. All mind is one mind. Here's that same statement. Each individual, that's each of us, is the individualization of the universal, the cosmic mind. So this is a statement of the principle of new thought, which is this identity with the universal mind. And this could have developed into an incredible psychology, and still could 100 years later. But behaviorism came along in the 1920s and knocked psychology out off its track that it had been on with William James for nearly 100 years. And then he points out that the dynamic of life as we live it is from the inside to the outside. So thoughts are causes, he says. Outer conditions are effects. The world without is a reflection of the world within. And he comments that a majority of mankind lives in the world without, which is still true. It was true in his day and still true now. Few have found the world within, yet it is the world within that makes the world without. And you can understand that in terms of imagination, design. Anything that you intend to do starts in the mind. Anything you create starts in the mind. This lecture started in my mind and in other minds. So here's another example of Thomas Troward, who was a circuit judge in Punjab. And he gave these very famous lectures on mental science, the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science in 1901. So in other words, about the same time as William James, who knew all about New Thought. The center of all being is also the center of our being. So it's a slightly different metaphor. It is one with ourselves. Individuality is the necessary complement to universal spirit. So what he explains is that the individual can't be universal, and the universal can't be individual. So the universal spirit has to individualize itself in us, hence the idea of a necessary complement. And he continues, the whole problem of life consists in finding the true relation of the individual to the universal originating spirit. So that's the task of each of us, is to find the true relation of ourselves, our individual consciousness, to the universal originating spirit. And if you go through this process of self-recognition, then you realize that your consciousness is essentially that same consciousness and that pervades the universe and the whole of life and other people. And I like this phrase here, that it is the generating center and we are distributing centers. Now, a slight excursion. Last year, I gave a lecture on the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. And I'm not going to say much about mystical theology in this, just a little bit. Then I'm going to finish by going on to talk about a recent book by Jeffrey Kripal called The Flip. So what Tim and Peter point out, and Tim Fricke is a very prominent philosopher in his own website, courses and everything, is that we also have fundamentalism and literalism in science, not just in religion. And that Gnosis and science posit the freedom to question. This is essential, freedom to question. It's what people are trying to close down at the moment. And I've been rereading Voltaire's Treatise on Tolerance from 1763 to see what he had to say about the question 250 years ago. The words Gnostic and scientist both mean knower. That's interesting. And they both represent a quest for truth, inner space, or real self-knowledge. Notice I have put self with a capital S there. And this is a statement of Gnosis. Realized Gnostics know that the knower and the known are one. They are the mystery of God manifesting as all that is. There is no self and other, no subject and object, all is one. Again, this is a realization that people have when they move into a non-dual state. With the realization of Gnosis, we find ourselves no longer separate from others, so others become ourselves in a sense, or indeed from anything, but at one in the mystery with all that is. We dissolve to mystical communion, and we are in love with all beings, hence this equivalent of love and light. And this is just more definitions here from people who are experts on Gnosis, Lorimer and Iain McGilchrist. So Lorimer says Gnostic knowledge is a lived experience of spiritual regeneration. It's knowledge of the beginning and the end. To know, this is a key phrase, means to become that same reality that is known, removing the dichotomy between subject and object. And science, as we currently practice it, is based on this dichotomy, this distinction between subject and object. So we need to go beyond that, but contain it. So the emphasis is on experience, not on doctrine. And of course, that means that Gnosis provides justification for not obeying priests and bishops, in other words, not submitting to authority, which is one of the reasons why mystics and Gnostics are unpopular with priests who are trying to get people to obey, because they have their own knowledge and they don't need the church as an intermediary. And this is Iain McGilchrist, these next two quotations here. This is from her book, The Gnostic Gospel, a very, very famous book in the field, came out in 1979. Gnosis is self-knowledge and knowledge of the self, equated with insight. To know oneself at the deepest level is simultaneously to know God. And then this I found really fascinating. I told you that April de Koninck is speaking next week on this book, The Gnostic New Age. And she talked about this practice of incubation in silence. And what surprised me, and I said this in my review, was that she didn't equate this with modern practices of meditation, which in fact it doesn't represent. So this incubation in silence is both the primal state of the ineffable God they seek and a bodily practice in which they engage to withdraw into this primal state, i.e. silence, as they return to the source of life. The primal God in Gnostic myths is a silent God, and the goal of the Gnostic journey is to withdraw back into this original silence, rest and stillness. It's what meditation is all about, resting in the silence, resting in the stillness. Silence is considered the state of utter transcendence, the very essence of ultimate reality in its original condition. And she continues by saying that a living silence is a state of silent light, which I think is a wonderful phrase, state of silent light. And this is illumination in the mystical meditative state. And she explains, this is part of what she'll be talking about next week, there were 4 Gnostic awakenings. The medieval Cathars and Bogomirs, which I'm very interested in, also live down in this area. The Hermetic Florentine Renaissance, going back to the Hermetic and Platonic texts. The 19th century discovery of some early Gnostic codices and the emergence of theosophy and understanding of Eastern texts and sacred books of the East, Max Muller, it's about 1880, Theosophical Society, 1875, and then, of course, New Thought about the same time. And then finally, the period since 1945, and especially since the 1960s, which includes what I referred to before, which is Jung and the transpersonal, near-death experiences, and the strong emergence of a movement of people who would identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, with an emphasis on non-duality and immanence, God dwelling within, and also a stress on experience, not doctrine, and on techniques like meditation. So I think that the esoteric and mystical view could provide a deeper basis for science. Now, I'm coming to the last part of my talk, and this is This is taken from Professor Jeff Kripal from Rice University. He's written a lot. And this, those of you who are members of the Scientific Medical Network, the lead article in the current issue that I've just sent round to members is by Jeff. And he's part of a group convened at Esalen Institute in California, who've been responsible for producing probably the most important books in the field, generally, hugely referenced and tightly argued. And the first one was Irreducible Mind in 2006, I think. And then 2015 was Beyond Physicalism. And then next year, they've got another 500-page book coming out, which is volume 3 of this trilogy. And I just read yesterday evening, Jeff Kripal's brilliant contribution to this. And also I was in touch with Ed Kelly from University of Virginia yesterday. He sent me the introduction. And this really sums up where consciousness studies is and why it needs to change in this direction. So the flip that he says science is half right, but it's only half right because it takes everything from the outside, not the inside. The flip is from an outside third-person perspective to an inside first-person perspective. So an object to the subject, third to first person. And he gives various examples of this, including Eben Alexander and Marjorie Woolacott, who spoke at Beyond the Brain last year. And these people were transformed not by arguments, but by experience. And he says that this encounter has to be personal, beyond linear thought, language, and belief. And the way you change people is through a crucial experience, not a crucial experiment. Skeptics will always demand another experiment, an extra experiment. You never get to the end of it. They're just not open to changing their minds. And he argues the mind is the locus of all scientific practice and knowledge, as we just seen with that quotation from Max Planck. So the flip gives a larger context than we currently have and suggests that what we should start from is our shared humanity and our shared human experience beyond individual cultures. And this is why he uses the phrase cosmic humanism. He criticizes both religious fundamentalism and ideological materialism as dogmatic. We already referred to that earlier in the talk. And then he gives examples of experiences that are regarded as impossible by orthodox academics and scientists. And the various examples that he gave of that. And he points out these things, they happen all the time, that can't happen at all. So obviously this is just not good enough. And as Lawrence Lashan points out in one of his books on paranormal, impossible facts don't happen. So if something happens, it's possible, and it therefore demands a theoretical explanation. If you don't have a good enough theoretical explanation, so much the worse for your theory, you'll have to change it. But what people do instead is let's ignore the data, and I'll come to that in the next couple of slides. And they stick to their own view and just ignore and dismiss these stories. Let me just give you one of the examples he gives. It's quite a striking one. So there's a man who he has a flat which overlooks a busy crossroads. Terrible place to have a flat. And he's woken up with a start at 2 o'clock in the morning to sound of a terrible crash and cars running into each other and so on. And he rushes to the window, nothing. There's nobody there, no cars, nothing. So he tells some friends about this experience. He said, I just can't understand it. So he goes to bed the next day, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, same thing happens. This incredible crash and noise, and he looks out of the window, and there's the crash. It has actually happened. So how do you explain that? So that's just one example of many, and I passionately believe that we have to arrive at our ideas in the face of the evidence, not dismiss evidence in order to maintain our ideas. And so the paranormal for academics is just a return to superstition, and there's a huge professional fear, fear of losing your reputation, your funding, your career, which goes back to at least as far as Kant, with his very unfair book on Swedenborg called Dreams of a Spirit Seer. So even Kant was afraid of losing his academic reputation. So when I was looking here at the structure of logic, and what Kripal cleverly points out is that our conclusions are really a function of our exclusions. So what we exclude from consideration shapes the conclusions we arrive at. And he adds, materialism rigorously leaves out everything it cannot explain. And in fact, it derides it. So the people, as you'll see from the next couple of remarks, this order of knowledge is disciplined and policed. So that there are reprisals in terms of your career, your research. You can't advance without thinking inside the box. So some just examples of this, reactions to Daryl Bem's publication on pre-sponse. These are experiments where people could have a sense in advance precognitively what was going to come up. And Thomas Nagel suggesting that materialism was incomplete in his book called Mind and Cosmos. And so the reactions in ordinary journals are vitriolic. And this is the heresy of challenging a materialist worldview. And it has to maintain its power and authority. And this is really about the politics of knowledge. And so this derision, this professional shaming, and also what he points out, and I've just referred to this earlier, that the dominance of the production model, i.e. that the brain produces consciousness, and suppression of the transmission model, which is what these books are trying to argue and advance. And so this is a Karl Popper phrase. He talked on Sir John Eccles, Karl Popper, Sir John Eccles. They talked about promissory materialism, by which is meant that if we can't explain it now in materialistic terms, we will eventually be able to, because materialism has explained everything else. And Kripal points out this is circular because it presumes what it's trying to establish. It presumes that materialistic explanations will be able to explain everything, when there's no grounds for supposing this is correct in the long term. It's just an assumption. And so he concludes, if the mind is not in the radio, the impossible becomes possible, indeed predictable. And this is where we desperately need to expand the academic and scientific framework. And so these are the sort of phrases that are often bandied about. You can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Occam's razor means that you can't multiply factors of explanation and really beyond the material. Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, there is extraordinary evidence, and it's just not true to say that there aren't. This isn't the case. And if these rules are challenged, and you tell people these are assumptions, then everything is just dismissed as pseudoscience, woo-woo, magical thinking, and anecdote. And if you look on the corresponding Wikipedia pages, both on complementary medicine and parapsychology, you'll see that they are curated by a group called the Guerrilla Skeptics, and they enforce the version of these pages that is already there, which is a skeptical view. And all the main complementary medical modalities, including Ayurveda, acupuncture, it's all pseudoscience. And so this is iniquitous. The journalists haven't been doing a proper job in outing this. And when you do challenge it, then you're taken off, you can be removed as an editor. And so things are dismissed and therefore missed, which is really serious situation. So what Kripal suggests, which I think is very, very promising, is that the humanities are, in fact, they represent the study of consciousness within culture. And i.e., there are different patterns of human experience that are interpreted and embedded in different cultural frameworks. But they're all expressions of a deeper stratum of reality. And this is what people have access to. In the essay I was reading today, he said that people concentrate on climbing the mountain, but the really important experience is the experience of the sky. There's no content in the sky. The sky is everywhere and nowhere, is everything and nothing. And the misstep, the misargument, if you like, is that these unique experiences are not amenable to the scientific method. And so it's concluded that anything beyond this must be unreal or unimportant, or even fraudulent. So what he suggests, this is Kripal, is that reality of meaning for us humans is sparked between the objective events and subjective states. It's what we make of things. And these symbols, they appear in this liminal in-between space, representing the both and rather than the either or. And symbol comes from symbalein in Greek, which means to throw together. So that this view is more Platonic than Aristotelian, though I think these views complement each other. And that dreams and what we call reality live on an imaginative spectrum, hence the synchronicity and resonance of the inside and the outside, whereby the inner and the outer and subjective and objective, as I've been suggesting, are not sharply distinguished in Gnosis. And you'll find that this is also the argument of Rick Tarnas's 2006 book, Cosmos and Psyche, where he first 100 pages or so, he argues this in very great detail, particularly with reference to Jung. So the future of knowledge, future politics of knowledge, and this is what we're trying to do within the Galileo Commission project, I'll show you the website of that at the end, is one of self-reflection and reflexivity. We must become more aware of who it is that's asking the question. This brings to mind a wonderful story from the philosopher Jacob Needleman, who went to see the great D.T. Suzuki, who was one of the people to introduce Zen into the West. And he was full of philosophy and ideas, just finished his PhD, and goodness, he was going to put D.T. Suzuki on the spot. So he started with his first question, and Suzuki paused a bit, and then he said, "Who is asking the question?" And that completely floored him, flummoxed him, and he forgot everything else he was going to say, but he never forgot that incident. So in this new view, the human whole and consciousness is prior and fundamental. That's where we need to start from. We need an interdisciplinary approach and an affirmation of our shared spiritual nature, implying an ethic of interconnectedness, as I've argued elsewhere. So we're in a deep crisis at the moment, a crisis of death and rebirth, I think. Huge evolutionary challenge that we are facing, spiritual terms, ecological terms, social, political, economic. And the pressure stoking up within the system, building up within the system, and creating huge tension. So we're really at a point of breakdown and or breakthrough, and a lot will depend on us collectively, and also on whether we succumb to authority and fear. We need to stand up above and beyond fear, or else we're simply going to be manipulated, as we're seeing very clearly at the moment. So it's not a time for despair and powerlessness and loss of hope. It's a time for vision. It's also a time that requires radical system change. And I'm lining up personally to watch Thrive 2, which is a sequel to the original film Thrive, which has been watched by tens of millions of people. The premiere for this, if you go to thrivemovement.com, premiere is on Saturday. in the evening. And the fundamental realization, this really sums up what I've been saying this evening, is that the realization of Gnosis is the realization of the oneness of life and consciousness. So that fundamentally we are each other, even if we're in different bodies. And therefore, we should apply the golden rule, at least the silver rule, which is the negative version, of planetary ethic, I call, of care and interconnectedness. Now, before I stop sharing, I just want to show you what we've got coming up in terms of Mystics and Scientists webinars. If you go to mysticsandscientists.org and you scroll down, then you can sign up for our mailing list. You get all notices for these. This is a very famous engraving from the 19th century of the man just managing to be outside the sphere. What if we can access the divine directly through Gnosis? So that's next week, Tuesday. And then the following week, we've got Jeff Kripal, The Flip. What if science and academia flipped into post-materialism? So this will be well worth listening to. And then the week after that, we've got Anne Baring, Awakening to a New Story, the evolutionary imperative of our time. That same week, we've got one with Noetic Sciences on Children Remember Previous Lives. 17th of October, we've got a film, the David Bohm Infinite Potential film, the director's cut, which is the longer version with a panel. So that's the following day. Then we've also got Beyond the Brain coming up, beyondthebrain.org. If you get in quickly before the end of the month, then you get the early bird rate of £75 for 3 days of online talks, which is jolly good value. You see Ed Kelly there from, I mentioned, Iain McGilchrist is speaking, other people from the States. And we've got some experiential work as well. And this is my new book, which comes out next year. Not sure when that's going to be the final cover, but that's what it's called, Quest for Wisdom, Inspiring Purpose on the Path of Life. And here are a number of websites. So the Galileo Commission I've been talking about, this is our initiative to try and expand science beyond a materialistic worldview. Scientific Medical Network, and then our website, our mysticsandscientists.org is the webinar site for the moment. And this is the next one. These next few are websites, and I can send these slides to Lance so that you can have them. And these are just, and so I think that's the end. Click to exit. Right, and my my mouse has come back, which is very good. And if I go back, stop sharing. There we go. I think I've gone slightly over time, but I sort of went through. Lance, you're muted. If you want to say something, we can't lip read.
No, I think I could ask somebody to unmute me.
No, you are. You're now with us.
Oh, great! Absolutely marvelous. Well, I think Scott, who's running this, will unmute people who want to talk. And thank you very much, David. That was absolutely great. I have 4 questions which I might put to you, but perhaps people have got some viva voce questions they'd like to put while I just have a look at these.
Yes, I'm just going to look at them myself because I can obviously see them on the screen.
Yes.
Did you want to go to a live question, or should I look at this first one?
Well, yeah, if there isn't a live question, let's go to it. And I think there may not be. So, yes, okay.
Well, we'll start with that.
Yeah, the recovering Catholic who's rejected the absurd underpinning of religion. And I therefore rejected God with it. How can I overcome my suspicion of that absolute concept? You know, God is this rather difficult concept in the terms you've been talking.
Well, I think that's exactly the point, that you need to come back to experience instead of ideas. That throughout the ages, people of all belief systems, including atheists, have experienced something beyond themselves. And so the rejection, David Ray Griffin is an American theologian whose most recent book I just reviewed recently. And he says that most new atheists reject what he calls Gawd, G-A-W-D. And Gawd is not God. I think I've got the book somewhere up here. And Gawd is the kind of caricature, omnipotent, omniscient God, which people following Whitehead's philosophy they just don't accept that idea. They say that even that the most maximum power that you can think of is constrained in some way by the outside, in inverted commas. So this whole that really leads to something incredible, and that's what. So a lot of people are actually rejecting the outdated ideas of God, not the mystical God. That would be my view.
Well, we have a related question there from Gavin Ritchie. To know something astonishing with utter certainty could be gnosis or could be pathology. Does science have a role in validating what we believe or know? If not, is there another process of validation?
No, hang on a second. I just need to turn my heater off. It's getting a bit warm in here.
I must say, Gavin, I think that's an excellent question. I mean,
Yes.
there's all the question behind all our stuff, which is whether perhaps we're going to be trumped or undermined by some scientific discovery or thesis, which might make, as it did for so many things in religion, might make our thing look a bit shaky. And so you often ask, for example, did Joan of Arc actually have communications from above, or was Joan of Arc merely a schizophrenic? That sort of thing, I imagine, is behind Gavin's question.
Yes, well, obviously certainty is no guarantee of truth. But I think the sort of certainty that Gavin may be referring to here is sort of intellectual certainty, and that you could simply be mistaken in your strong belief. So you might know with certainty that the world was created in 4004 BC, or believe with certainty, and we know that simply isn't true. And so again, Griffin is very selective. He says we need to look at what these various articles of belief are and classify them as, some of them will be absolutely false. But what I'm talking about here is not so much is an experience of knowledge by identity, which is a different form of experience and knowledge. And so the certainty with which the mystics speak is existential certainty, and it's not the kind of certainty that you want to go and impose on anybody else. I think that's an important point. You couldn't
impose it on anybody else.
Well, exactly, you couldn't, and but also it corresponds to what the mystics talk about in terms of what I analogically talked about, experiencing the sky, and the non-dual state. You find that in all advanced mystical traditions across cultures. And I think the other point to bring in here would be contemplative neuroscience. And that really provides some correspondences without proof. In other words, the experiences reported subjectively by monks and nuns who are part of these experiments, they could say something about their state of mind, which then might correspond to a particular brain state, which is measurable by the instruments that they're hooked up to. But that again, that's a correspondence between quality and quantity, rather than establishing that one is necessarily true.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that. I've got a very lovely question here. There are one or two people who are just saying, thank you for a very nice talk. But Kay has produced this question, which attracts me. She says, we all have consciousness, and so we take it for granted. We use it without understanding how it works. We can have knowledge of the power of consciousness energy without great intellect. Perhaps the more intelligent have more curiosity and a desire to understand, but the implication is that it's universally available, or that consciousness can work for everybody, or gnosis is available to everybody. I mean, one would hope, I suppose, in this democratic age, that it is not only, available to graduates, if you see what I mean. What's your take on that?
Not at all. I mean, I would rephrase that slightly, saying we have an immediate, we are conscious, we have an immediate experience of consciousness, rather than having consciousness in inverted commas. And of course, this doesn't come with a user's guide, and no, life doesn't come with a user's guide either. You know, we tend to take on what our culture tells us, and that includes science, as to know the answer to these questions. And so the spiritual path or spiritual disciplines are often a way of cultivating and advancing one's understanding of consciousness and moving towards a more conscious state, so that you can respond to things rather than just react. So I think generally, whatever consciousness we've got, it's a good thing to have more of it.
I think you're right. You sound a little bit like, and I hope you'll agree with this, or if anybody else wants to ask a question, please put up your hand, but this would be mine. It's simply to bring up the name Eckhart Tolle, because one of the things which I find so impressive in his lectures, which you can easily see on YouTube, he is so wonderful, so amusing as well, but is that he says we must be more conscious, must be more conscious, some of the things you've been saying, more Gnostic. But he says that when you are more conscious, you're more present. You're more in presence. And I know that he's doing a little trick there, because presence is one of the traditional Christian theological ways of describing God. And present means now, so it's always now, and consciousness is always now, and God lives in the eternal present, so it's always now. So Eckhart Tolle sort of collapses everything into this point of consciousness where if you're really conscious, you're really present, it's really now, and God is by definition there and is with you at that time. That's a wonderful simplification of some of the things you've been saying, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I agree. I like that very much, because it brings you into the present moment, being conscious in the present moment. And that's always what great spiritual teachers say. They say the ego lives too much in the past and the future, and whereas the awakened person lives completely in the present and lives intensely in the present. And by the same token, they are present to the people with whom they are present, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah, when you read these mystics, in the end, you realize that you're going round in certain circles, but I think that's part of the territory. I'm very sorry, I've read out the questions which we've had, and nobody has yet had a live question.
No. Shall I just address Peter Lloyd's question first, and then I can see that Christine would like to ask something.
And then Morag after that.
Yes.
No, sorry, Christine.
Peter, that's a very good question. I don't make any of these, I don't make an absolute distinction. I'm just talking about the resources on which you draw. And so when I was talking about the eye of contemplation, the eye of reason, and the eye of sense, the eye of contemplation is the eye that sees inward, if you like, and it's also known as the eye of the heart. And this is something which is developed by contemplative practices and contemplatives, but it's not part of scientific training. Scientific training is training in logic, evidence, replication, and so on. And what I always emphasize is that I'm all for evidence-based inquiry and the use of reason. But reason is something that you apply to what you're looking at. And how you look at what you're looking at will depend on your assumptions and presuppositions and background. And so in that sense, rational inquiry is something which is applied to the evidence, but also comes within a framework that you're operating in. So I don't at all equate rationality with physicalism. I see that rational inquiry is an important part of philosophical method, scientific method, psychological method. And what you call the rational idealists, rejecting irrational modes of thinking, but I always wonder what is defined in those terms as irrational? Does that mean emotional? Does that mean it's illogical? Does that mean it's something which is medieval superstition? And if it's a medieval superstition or superstition where the explanation, obviously doesn't correspond to what you're looking at, then I would agree with you. And I think the tendency within philosophy and consciousness studies now is moving towards panpsychism. So some materialists have become panpsychists, and this is argued by Jeff Kripal in his book, and also towards idealism, where the world is in your mind, and which is true for us. And this is part of if you go to the Headless Way, which is one of the exercises I've been doing recently, then there are exercises that will kind of reverse your point of view to realize that everything is in your mind, that as you experience the phenomenal world, it's inside you. And realizing that it's the one consciousness that's seeing through you is this realization of non-duality. But I don't, in that sense, because you can occasionally transcend reason, and Iain McGilchrist would definitely argue this, then that doesn't mean to say that you're not rigorous in the way you use reason, but you apply it from a different point of view. I hope that's...
Yes, of course. Yes, I understand that. Okay, thank you, David. We have a question from Christine Smith, if Scott or Pauline would like to unmute her. Could that be done?
I think I've been unmuted. Yes. No, I just wanted to make the point that it's been a fascinating talk. I have really enjoyed it, and I can follow what you're talking about, and it's really been good. But it's vastly complicating, to my mind, something that is really quite simple. The practice is, if you were to read all these books that you've got but you're not going to get the experience of the interaction with the divine while you're actually reading. It takes up a lot of time that you might be doing the practicing and getting in touch with the greater consciousness. And it is fascinating. And if you've got that kind of inquiring mind, I love all these talks that go into in great detail. But how does it become simplified for the bigger public to make it accessible, to get it beyond the academic realms that it's reaching at the moment, to make it something that people can grasp and bring into their own lives on a kind of more lower level, as it were. Sorry,
yeah,
that's just...
Thank you, Christine. Obviously, I come from a background of very considerable reading, and part of what I do for a living is reading. and I write a lot of reviews. So you're right that the simple, direct methods are given, by meditation teachers and whatever it is that suits you temperamentally. I mean, one of the interesting points that this 45 Days to Awakening course does, which is what I've been doing, but I'm not awakened, is that they feel that you need to try out different meditative methods in order to find out what is a match for you. So you can go on using the same one for years without any real results, because it actually wasn't the right one for you to use. And so one of the things that Peter Fenwick is doing, who's the president of the network, and I can see Carol here, she's a regular, is that on a Sunday evening for members of the network, you can do a meditation with him. And for each week, for the last several weeks, he's been giving a different meditation.
Right.
And so the one he gave on Sunday was something that was called Lester's Love Technique, which is how to transform all the experiences of negativity with people into love.
Yeah.
Practice. So again, that's very, very simple.
Yeah.
And so I suppose a lot of the sages have been, simple people. If you look at someone who was talking about Jacob Boehme, I think that was Peter actually on Sunday, and Jacob Boehme was a cobbler until he had an experience of enlightenment. Then he started writing books. So I think it's very important to be fully engaged in life as it is, and books are secondary.
It just, you would run out of time to do the practices if you were to read all the books about it. I was a bit for fear, you know. Thank you for answering my question.
That's an excellent question. I've got another one here. I don't see any other hands up, but Jenny Jemison is saying, when we reflect inwards, are we drawing on our self-experience or the universal consciousness, assuming that universal consciousness is not the knowledge gained by humanity's learning, but something outside that? Quite an interesting epistemological.
Yeah, it is. Well, you see, this is the subtle shift that I suppose there's an intermediary stage whereby you can move into what Hindus call the witness state. In other words, you are witnessing your own thought processes from another vantage point. And in the Upanishads, it talks about the two birds in the same tree, and one of them singing, and the other one is watching the singing. And so when you move from being completely identified with your thoughts and emotions to witnessing them, then you've made that first move towards a realization of the one consciousness which is operating through you, rather than it being you. Then you're just having an individual consciousness. And so that's what the piece I had from Thomas Troward, he said that's what's meant by self-recognition, that you go from thinking that it's all coming from yourself to realizing that the consciousness that is operating through all of us, you know, not just, you know, we're here this evening, the consciousness operating through everybody is actually the same consciousness. There's only one mind. And that's what's difficult for us to get our heads around, because we assume there are lots of minds, we each have an individual one, which again is true at one level. But if we could get more of a sense of shared mind, then I think we would treat each other rather better. And I think
that's very nice. There's another version of the same question that Christine's been asking from Peter Bruin coming up on the chat there. Some of the Christian mystics like Padre Pio seem much closer to Gnosis than dogma. And in a sense, I think Christine's question was Gnosis or dogma, you know, books or experience. No wonder the church was terrified of this transcendental stuff catching on. On the other hand, Padre Pio is a Christian priest, or was a Christian priest.
Well, he's now a saint.
Indeed, now a saint. That's right.
There's 45 days of awakening in the chat.
Yes.
If you Google that, there's a course just started. Peter Fennick put me onto it. Yeah, Padre Pio is an extraordinary man. And one of the people who, again, I was corresponding with the essay is Michael Grosso, who's an American philosopher. And his last book was on St. Joseph of Cupertino. Who's
the man who could fly.
Yeah, exactly. And where there are, and again, that's impossible. You know, people don't levitate, but they do, or he did. And he talked a lot about the extraordinary experiences of Padre Pio, be in two places at once. He would appear at a distance, he'd heal people. So he obviously was at a mastery level. And I think the person that I am most influenced by, Peter Dunoff, was also in that kind of level. And you know, in other words, those people can perform what we would call miracles, because their state of consciousness is so advanced, and they're so selfless in their application of things that these things can come naturally. So in other words, I feel that what the capacities that are demonstrated by people like Padre Pio are advanced human capacities. In other words, that if we all develop ourselves to that extent, then this would happen to us as well. In many cases, it happens unconsciously.
You remind me of Rupert Sheldrake saying a couple of weeks ago that all the stuff we call paranormal and parapsychological is actually normal and psychological, because it does happen in nature, because everything happens in nature, including the full divine.
Exactly.
Well, listen, Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely wonderful. It's a great talk, and you've got some lots of little claps from everybody who's been here. And thank you everybody for coming. David's mentioned Iain McGilchrist. You've probably noticed on the Arthur Conan Doyle website and from your emails that Iain McGilchrist is coming to talk to us relatively soon. The keen young panpsychist who has a lot to say about consciousness, Philip Goff from Durham University, is also coming to us in the ensuing weeks. All I can say is Tuesday evenings at 7:30, watch this space, and let's hope that the standard of lecture and debate continues at the level at which we've had it this evening. Thank you very much indeed, David, and I'll take the opportunity to say good night to everybody now and leave the meeting.
Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoyed your company and have a good rest of your evening. And if you, as I say, if you want to be on our mailing list, then go to mysticscientist.org. And if you want to know anything about what we're doing down here, then I'm dl@scimednet.org. I'll just put that in the chat.
He's quite easy to find. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, and good night.